Every morning began the same. The old woman would sit beside the small wooden table near the window, a cup of tea cooling in her hands, her eyes fixed on the silent phone. She never said it out loud, but she hoped each day that this would be the morning it rang, that one of her children would remember her voice. It had been months since the last call, a quick conversation, promises to visit soon, words that had faded with time. She told herself they were busy, families, work, lives full of noise. But deep inside, the quiet truth hurt. They had forgotten. Not out of cruelty, but out of distance. She would check the phone again before bed, her hand resting on the receiver for a moment, just to feel the cool weight of it. Once, she even dialed her eldest son's number, but when his voicemail answered, she couldn't bring herself to speak. She hung up and whispered instead, "Good night, my dear." The silence that followed felt endless. She closed her eyes and prayed that tomorrow might bring a ring, a voice, a sign that she still mattered. But the only sound was the steady ticking of the clock, a reminder that time keeps moving, even when hearts stand still. The house, once alive with laughter and footsteps, had grown still. The rooms were clean, perfectly ordered, not because she loved tidiness, but because there was nothing else left to do. Dust gathered more slowly now. There were fewer movements to stir it. She would walk through the hallway, her fingers brushing against the walls, as though they might remember the touch of her children's hands. Once, the kitchen had been full of noise, breakfast plates clattering, little voices asking questions, stories told between spoonfuls of soup. Now the quiet was so deep that she could hear her own heartbeat. At night, the silence became heavier. It pressed against the walls, filling the space where conversation used to live. Sometimes she would turn on the radio just to hear another voice, but even the cheerful songs made her ache. They reminded her of the world outside, the one that seemed to have forgotten she existed. And yet, despite the loneliness, she couldn't leave. This house was her last link to the people she loved, their laughter still clinging faintly to the walls. It was both her refuge and her prison, a place where memories lived louder than the present. She sighed and whispered into the emptiness, "Lord, I still love them, even if they never come back." Every evening, before she turned off the lamp, she visited the small shelf that lined one corner of her living room. It held her life, framed pieces of love and time. Her wedding photo stood at the center, she and her husband, young, radiant, forever smiling. Around it were the faces of her children, birthdays, graduations, weddings. She touched each frame gently, tracing the outlines with trembling fingers. "You were so small then," she said softly to one picture. "You used to fall asleep in my arms before dinner." Her voice cracked as she looked at another. "And you promised you'd always call." But none of the faces answered. They smiled at her from another life, frozen in joy that seemed unreachable now. She lingered over her husband's photo the longest. "You would know what to say," she whispered. "You'd tell me to be strong, but it's hard to be strong when no one remembers you." A single tear fell, landing on the glass over his face. She wiped it gently, as if afraid to disturb him. Then she stepped back and turned off the light. The shelf glowed faintly in the moonlight, her silent company through another long night. It was a quiet morning, too quiet for what the day meant. The date on the calendar stared back at her birthday, the same day she used to celebrate surrounded by laughter, candles and voices that now lived only in memory. She smiled faintly, more out of habit than joy. "Another year," she whispered. "Thank you, Lord, even if no one remembers." She made herself a small breakfast, tea, toast, a single egg, and placed a tiny flower from her garden on the table, a gift to herself. For a brief moment, she let her mind drift to other birthdays. The sound of her children singing off-key, her husband pretending to blow out the candles with her. Those memories still glowed softly, even if their echoes had faded. The phone sat beside her, silent as ever. She checked it twice, though she hadn't heard it ring. "Maybe they'll call later," she told herself. "Maybe they just forgot what day it is." But as evening came and the sky turned gold, her hope grew smaller. When the day ended without a word, she went to bed early. Lying there, she prayed not for a call, but for the strength not to grow bitter. "Lord," she whispered, "I know they love me. They just forgot." And in that simple acceptance, though her heart ached, a quiet grace began to stir. The next morning, she sat at her small writing desk by the window. A sheet of paper lay before her, blank and waiting. She picked up her pen and began to write, slowly, carefully, the words she could not speak. "My dear children," she began, "I hope you are well. I miss you more than I can say. The house is quiet now, but I keep it tidy, just as you remember. The garden still blooms, though not as much as it used to. I pray for you every night. I hope you still think of me." Her handwriting trembled as she continued. The ink smudged where her tears fell, but she kept writing. She told them about the cat that visited her porch, about the hymn she still hummed in the mornings, about how she dreamed of seeing them again, just once more. When she finished, she folded the letter neatly and slipped it into an envelope. Her hand hovered over the spot where the stamp should go. Then she sighed, set the letter aside and whispered, "They're busy. Maybe I shouldn't bother them." O'Day, she placed it in a small drawer with others just like it, letters never sent, filled with love too quiet for the world to hear. Every afternoon, she walked to the edge of her small front yard to check the mailbox. It had become a ritual, not because she expected anything, but because hope needs movement even when it's tired. The rusted metal door creaked as she opened it. Empty. Always empty. She smiled anyway, though it didn't reach her eyes. Maybe tomorrow, she murmured, closing it gently. She ran her hand over the cool surface, as though it might someday carry the warmth of a letter inside. Sometimes she imagined what it would feel like to find one. An envelope with her name written in familiar handwriting, a voice from far away reaching back. Even a postcard would be enough. Something to say, "You are not forgotten." But the mailbox stayed still, day after day, reflecting only the sky and her quiet face. As she turned to walk back inside, she whispered a prayer. "Lord, if no one writes to me, could you send something from you instead?" She didn't know it yet, but that prayer, so small, so humble, had already been heard. The days began to blur together. One long stretch of quiet hours, marked only by meals and the shifting light through the window. Morning came and went without meaning. Afternoon lingered like a sigh. Evening brought the same lonely silence that wrapped itself around her shoulders like a shawl she could not take off. Her body moved out of habit now, sweeping, cooking, folding, praying. But even prayer had grown tired. She still whispered her words each night, though they felt like petals falling into a deep, still pond. No echo, no ripple, no reply. Sometimes she would pause mid-task and look around the room, forgetting for a moment what she was doing. The house seemed almost alive, watching her, waiting for her to speak, but she had run out of words. She sat one afternoon with her hands folded in her lap, staring at nothing. "Lord," she said softly, "I don't ask for much anymore. Just let me know you still see me." It wasn't desperation this time. It was weariness, the kind that seeps into the soul, the kind that turns time into something heavy. Yet even in her fatigue, something faint still lingered, a fragile thread of faith, almost invisible, but unbroken. That night, the weight became heavier. The darkness in her room seemed thicker, pressing against the walls, pressing against her chest. She lay awake, listening to the sound of her own breath, the only proof that she was still alive. What if God has forgotten me too? The thought came quietly, almost gently, but it struck her like a knife. She had spent her life believing in his care, his promises, his presence, but years of silence can erode even the strongest faith. She turned on her side and stared at the cross on her wall, its shadow faint in the dim light. "Were you ever really listening?" she whispered. The words frightened her, not because they were blasphemous, but because they were honest. Her heart ached, not in anger, but in grief. To be forgotten by her children was one thing. But to think heaven might have done the same, that was a loneliness too deep to name. Tears slid down her cheeks, quiet as rain. She didn't wipe them away. She simply let them fall, hoping that maybe, just maybe, one would reach the feet of God. The next night came colder. A soft rain tapped against the window, each drop echoing the rhythm of her heart. She sat up in bed, her blanket wrapped tightly around her shoulders, and wept. Not the kind of weeping that seeks comfort, but the kind that comes from an emptiness too deep to hide. She cried for her children, for the days when they needed her, for the laughter that once filled the kitchen, for the birthdays they no longer remembered. She cried for her husband, for the strength he once gave her, for the hand she longed to hold again. And finally, she cried for herself, for the woman she used to be, the one who believed she was still seen. The tears came in waves, breaking through the walls she had built for years. She didn't try to stop them. She let them fall, letting each one carry the ache her words could not express. When at last her sobs began to fade, she whispered into the darkness, "Jesus, I can't do this alone anymore. If you still love me, please, come." Then the room fell still. The only sound was the rain, soft and steady. She closed her eyes, exhausted, unaware that her prayer, small, cracked and trembling, had reached the heart of heaven, and heaven was already moving. It was deep into the night when she awoke. The rain had stopped, and a strange calm filled the room, the kind of stillness that hums softly, alive yet silent. She lay there, unsure what had stirred her. The air felt different, not cold but warm, tender, like a blanket gently laid over her heart. For a moment, she thought she heard something. Not with her ears, but somewhere deeper. A sound softer than breath, quieter than the ticking of the clock. It wasn't a word exactly, but it carried meaning, a kind of peace that seemed to whisper, "I'm here." She sat up slowly, her frail hands clutching the blanket. The darkness no longer frightened her. The room seemed to glow faintly, though no light was burning. Her pulse steadied, her breathing calmed. She didn't understand what was happening, but she knew she was not alone. It wasn't imagination, it wasn't the wind. It was something sacred, something she had prayed for without believing it would ever come. Her lips trembled as she whispered, "Jesus." The silence did not answer, but it didn't need to. The stillness itself was the answer. The next morning, the peace remained. It lingered in the air, in the way the sunlight touched the curtains, in the rhythm of her own heartbeat. She moved carefully through the house, her every step guided by something unseen. It was as though another presence walked beside her, keeping pace with her slow, deliberate movements. When she sat down with her tea, she felt it more clearly. Someone there, quiet, but unmistakably real. She didn't see him. yet she knew who it was. There was no fear, only a warmth that filled her from within. The loneliness that had haunted her seemed to retreat, replaced by a presence that felt like home. Her eyes filled with tears, but they were different now, light, not heavy. "You came," she whispered, her voice trembling. "After all this time, you came." In that moment, she didn't need to speak more. She simply sat in the stillness, her heart open, her soul listening. There were no thunderous revelations, no visions, no voices, just peace, and that peace was more than enough to heal years of silence. He had entered, not with words, but with love. That afternoon, as she sat in her chair knitting, she felt something she hadn't known in years, the gentle touch of care. Her hands, stiff from arthritis, suddenly relaxed. It was as if invisible fingers had wrapped around them, soothing, steadying, tender. Her breath caught, and she looked around. The room was quiet, sunlight streaming softly through the lace curtains, yet the touch remained, real, solid, warm, not a vision, not a dream, but something more real than either. Tears welled up in her eyes. "Lord," she whispered, "you're really here, aren't you?" The warmth deepened in response, spreading through her frail body, easing her pain, filling every empty space that loneliness had carved out through the years. It was not healing of the body she felt, but of the soul, the kind of healing that restores forgotten places, that mends what time cannot. She closed her eyes and rested her hands in her lap. For the first time in a long time, she felt cared for, not by her children, not by the world, but by the one who had never forgotten her. In that quiet moment, the ache of abandonment began to dissolve, replaced by the steady rhythm of divine compassion. The next day, she moved through the house with a lightness she hadn't felt in years. The pain was still there, yes, but it didn't seem to weigh as heavily on her. She made her way to the kitchen, and as she opened the cupboard to prepare a simple meal, something caught her eye. There, in the corner of the shelf, was a loaf of bread. She didn't remember buying it. Curious, she took it down and sliced off a piece. It was warm, fresh, as if it had been baked just for her. As she buttered it and took the first bite, she felt a quiet joy fill her. She wasn't sure why, but it tasted like a gift, a small, simple gift. She sat at the table and stared out the window, watching the soft light spill into the room. For the first time in years, she didn't feel forgotten. It wasn't because of the bread or the warm light. It was because, deep in her soul, she knew Jesus had provided. He had cared for her, not in grand gestures, but in small, tender ways. She smiled, her heart swelling with gratitude. He's been here all along, she realized, in the quiet moments, in the small acts of care, and she knew more clearly than ever that he would always provide, Not just bread, but light, love, and the strength to carry on. Later that afternoon, as she walked through the garden, something shifted inside her. The flowers she had planted years ago, though weathered and frail, seemed to breathe again. The old tree in the corner, though gnarled, stood tall, its branches reaching toward the sky as if in silent prayer. She knelt beside a rosebush, her hands shaking as she touched its delicate petals. And in that moment, a memory returned. Vivid, clear, as though it had never left. Her children running through the garden, laughing as they played. The smell of her husband's cologne as he worked beside her, their hands brushing as they planted the very roses that now bloomed once more. The tears came not from sadness, but from a deep, quiet joy. I am not forgotten, she thought. I was never forgotten. The memories didn't hurt as they once had. They were no longer reminders of loss, but of love, of a life once shared, of moments still alive in her heart. She closed her eyes and whispered, "Thank you, Lord, for bringing it all back to me." And as the evening sun bathed the garden in golden light, she knew her memories were hers to keep, not just of what was lost, but of what had always remained. The morning came quietly, the air crisp and fresh as it often was in the spring. She woke to the sound of birds singing outside her window, and for the first time in a long while, she didn't feel the heaviness of pain when she moved. Her joints still ached, but there was a lightness to her body, as if it no longer held the weight of years. She stood slowly, stretched, and walked to the window. The light was soft, spilling over the rooftops and onto the garden below. The pain had not gone away completely, but it no longer dominated her every step. As she stood there, watching the world awaken, she realized the quiet truth. The pain had lifted. Not because her body was healed in the way she had once prayed for, but because her heart had been restored. The ache in her soul, the loneliness, the abandonment, the silence, had been replaced by something far deeper. Peace. A peace that filled every crack and corner, not by removing the pain, but by giving it a new place to rest. She sat down at the table, breathing deeply, her hands folded in her lap. She didn't need to ask for healing anymore. She simply whispered, "Thank you, Lord, for lifting me up." And in that moment she knew. She had been held all along. That evening, she sat by the window once again, the Bible open on her lap. The pages turned softly in the breeze, and her eyes fell on a verse she had underlined long ago. "I have called you by name. You are mine." She read it aloud, her voice trembling but sure. Something deep inside her stirred, not a memory, but a recognition. Then it happened. Not the ring of a phone, not a knock at the door, but a call, clear, silent, unmistakable, rising in her heart like a whisper that carried eternity in it. "My child." Her breath caught. The room seemed to fill with a holy warmth, as though heaven itself had leaned close to speak. She didn't hear words exactly, but she understood. Every unanswered prayer, every tear, every lonely night, he had seen them all. He had counted them, held them, and now he was answering in the only way that mattered, by calling her his. She pressed her hand to her heart, tears falling freely. "You never forgot me," she whispered, "even when I thought you had." The air around her shimmered with peace. It was not the kind of peace that fades. It was eternal, like a melody written before time began. The call had come, not from the world that had overlooked her, but from the one who had loved her all along. In the days that followed, small miracles began to unfold. The neighbors who once passed by with polite smiles now stopped to talk. A child from next door brought her flowers from the garden. A young man offered to fix her fence. The world around her, once silent and distant, seemed to come alive with kindness. She welcomed each gesture with quiet wonder. There was no surprise in her gratitude, only the gentle awareness that it was Jesus working through these hands, these hearts. Every act of care was a reflection of his promise. "I will not leave you." One morning the postman left a letter in her box, the first in years. It was from her eldest daughter. Apologies, regret, a promise to visit soon. Her hands trembled as she read, but her heart remained calm. She had already forgiven long ago, in the quiet moments when Jesus had taught her how to love without expecting anything in return. That night she prayed not in loneliness, but in gratitude. "Lord," she said softly, "you brought them back to me, not because I asked, but because you healed the space between us." And outside, in the stillness, it seemed the stars shone brighter, as if heaven itself rejoiced in her restored joy. The love that had once filled her heart now overflowed. She began baking small loaves of bread, leaving them for the neighbors who had helped her. She wrote tiny notes of encouragement and placed them under doors. She started calling people from her church, offering prayer instead of waiting for someone to pray for her. Her hands, though frail, found purpose again. Her words, once choked by silence, now carried peace. She had learned the secret of love, that it multiplies when it is given away. One afternoon she saw the young mother from across the street crying on her porch. Without thinking, the old woman went to her, placed a hand on her shoulder, and whispered, "You are not forgotten." The same words that had healed her were now healing another. That night, as she sat by her window, she looked out at the small lights in the neighboring homes and smiled. Her heart was full, not of things, not of people, but of presence. She had spent years waiting to be cared for. Now she understood. She had been cared for all along, so that she could learn to care for others in his name. The day came quietly, golden and still. She sat at her small writing desk once again, the same one where she had written countless unsent letters, each one a cry of longing, of love, of sorrow. But today felt different. There was no tremor in her hand, no ache in her chest, only peace. She took out a fresh sheet of paper and began to write. "My dear children, you do not need to be sorry for forgetting. I understand now how life moves, fast, demanding, full of noise. I only want you to know that I am well." Jesus has taken care of me in ways I cannot explain. He has been my comfort, my strength, and my joy. I no longer wait for calls, for visits, or for letters. I simply wait for his whisper, and it never fails to come. I love you always, and I forgive everything because I was never truly alone. Love never leaves us. It just waits to be seen again, with all my heart. Mother. When she sealed the envelope, her hands didn't shake. She placed it gently in the mailbox, smiled at the morning sun, and whispered, "This one's not for them alone. It's for you too, Lord." As she turned back toward her home, the breeze caught her hair, and she felt it, that same invisible warmth she had come to know. A quiet joy filled her soul. The letter had been sent, and not only to her children, but to heaven itself. That evening, the light in her home was softer than usual, a golden hush that filled every room. She sat by the window, watching the day surrender to dusk, her hands resting peacefully in her lap. The phone remained silent, but it no longer mattered. She was no longer waiting. She was already seen. In the gentle quiet, she spoke aloud, not to the air, but to the presence that now filled her heart. "You cared for me when no one else did. You found me when the world forgot. And now I am whole." Her words hung in the stillness, received like a prayer. The room felt warm, alive, as though love itself lingered there, invisible but radiant, her eyes closed, her breathing steady, her heart finally free of longing. Outside, the stars began to bloom in the dark sky. The world, unaware, moved on. But in that small house, once filled with silence, peace reigned. Not the kind of peace that ends sorrow, but the kind that transforms it into grace. She smiled faintly and whispered one last time, "I was never forgotten." And in the stillness that followed, it was as if heaven itself whispered back, "No, my child, you were remembered every moment in my heart."